We've got a good group with us today. Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for joining. Brian, great to have you again. Appreciate it. Gustavo. Lindsay, very nice to have you. Thank you for joining. Okay. Good. Angie, you just joined us. Thank you. Tim. Amber, thank you for joining us. Denise, thank you for being here today. Good group. Rachel, Tim, thank you so much for coming. Just give it another minute. People are still joining. Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Glenn Yopes, and on behalf of GLLG, thank you. Thanks for taking the time to join me this afternoon as we all interview Megan Fritz, otherwise known as the Truth Seeker, who also serves as Customer VP at General Mills, who will discuss the topic today of reclaiming our identity. I'd like to remind everyone that this session is a Q&A session. It will not happen at the end, but rather throughout the program. We have GLLG staff on standby awaiting for all your questions. And to submit questions, please enter them into the Q&A module on the Zoom control panel. GLLG staff will organize the flow of the questions to the best of our ability to ensure that you can address your thoughts with an open mic. In fact, from time to time, I might just call you out if I see that you've been active on chat, just to make sure that we hear your voice so that you're active in the conversation. Now, if you think of a chronic condition as that's something that's long developing, and an acute condition is something that's more sudden and severe. See, the recent murder of George Floyd and subsequent social unrest the world over has reminded us of this long developing identity crisis in corporate America. You know, the identity crisis is a chronic condition brought on by, as you know, our content, years of standardization. Employees that have lost their identity because of it, or they just don't know their full individual capacity. See, they haven't been given the freedom or the room to contribute in their own way. It's very hard for people to discover what makes them distinct, unique, and special. Now, there are leaders that are mourning the loss of their own identity and actually feel the futility of making that sacrifice for nothing. Here's an example, and I quote, "I practiced all of our values. All of my performance ratings were high to very high based upon how they wanted me to work. I emulated my work and my style based on 5 other senior executives in the organization. I did everything they wanted me to do, and I'm not even being considered for the VP position." See, but here's the paradox as illustrated by this very real example. See, this leader created a path for success based on how the company wanted him to behave and based on how other people who have been successful at that company. Now that seems like a logical approach, doesn't it? See, but here's the problem. This particular individual didn't provide any real distinct value. This person commoditized himself. See, this person's frustration is understandable because as he shared with me, that's what I thought the company wanted. But what they did was strip that individual of their identity. They unknowingly gave him the chronic disease. Now, that chronic disease threatens to be overpowered by the acute. What do I mean by that? See, everything about our lives has changed, and the uncertainty about the future is just overwhelming. I mean, uncertainty is the acute disease. Now, people are suddenly working from home, managing teams from afar, and with a workload that oftentimes feels chaotic and unmanageable. This has all created a sense of trauma. And with the surge of COVID, we have a massive uncertainty about everything right now, and we want it to go away. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful so that we don't treat the acute disease at the expense of the chronic disease. See, it's tempting to meet uncertainty with a dose of standardization because standardization feels more certain. And from the standpoint of the business, it can feel like we can regain control. See, in standardization, the business defines the individual. People are told what to do inside the box they're given. Progress towards the company mission is what is measured and what matters. We protect our functions and work with inside our silos. See, it's a business model that was designed to hold people back. See, it's a system that will no longer work. And it's a system that created the identity crisis in the first place. So, what's the way forward? Where do we move from here? See, we must achieve dignity at scale. And the only way to do that is scaling one's individual capacity and capabilities. Now, speaking for myself, I feel and internalize the most dignity when I'm able to tackle a worthwhile challenge using my full brain, my full set of skills, and my full expertise, my full talent, when I'm able to contribute at my full capacity. And this just isn't me. I'd actually bet that most people that are on this live stream today feel the same thing. This takes us to our special guest, Megan Fritz, who recently shared something with me that I'm going to share with you in a moment. But Megan, come join the show. I'm excited to have you on board. And thank you so much for being courageous enough to share your journey.
Hi, Glenn. Can you guys see and hear me?
Of course we can. And you look fantastic. And I love the fish tank and the matching aqua pillows in the background. now, Megan, if I can take you back about 8, 10, I think it's maybe a year ago, as I come to think of the math, you shared something with me that was extraordinarily powerful. And I'd like to share it with everyone that's on the live stream night right now as we look at your quote. It says as follows: I wish I was 23 again because I had a lot of fresh thoughts. Most of them were just too much for a Fortune 500 company. And I spent 19 years trying to cull it down. You don't spend 19 years at a large company being successful without a high level of assimilation. I discovered I really wish I had my 23-year-old self, and now it's really hard to find. And I'm sad about that. I see my struggle. I see it on my team, my organization, our leaders, our people, everywhere, everyone struggling to work through it. It's complex, it's chaotic, and there's a better way. Megan, if you can go back when you shared this with me, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? And how has this sentiment taken on a whole new life in today's more personalized world?
Thank you for the question. Every time I see the quote, I cringe a little bit. And I cringe just because I hadn't realized over all these years of doing my work that I hadn't realized like how much of myself I was leaving at the door, until one day I kind of woke up and realized that, you know, over the course of 19 years, it was a lot about, okay, this is how I am, but this is what it takes to be successful. And the two have been divergent for a really long time. And so I slowly started to present information differently. I dealt with conflict differently. Some of it, I think, was just maturing with age. You know, how you are at 23 versus 41 should look different. I think some of it was naturally just maturity. And then some of it was me just trying to find a way to fit in because I wanted to be successful. I wanted to be liked. I wanted to be effective. I wanted to be all those things. And I was very much looking towards the leaders that were successful as a way to emulate. And I was so good at that that I started to forget or lose sight of, is that really how I would do it? And then when you and I had first met, I was like, oh, is that actually what I want to do? And is what I want to do and how I'd like to do it and how I'm currently doing it, like how aligned are they? And I had just gone through for so long without like having that inner dialogue that when I started to ask myself, okay, is this really what I think? Is this really what I believe? That it was harder to answer those questions than it should have been. And I think that's the sadness part of my statement.
Well, first of all, Megan, thank you for sharing that. And, you know, if we can just get really real right now, there's a lot of conflict in the world. People are uncertain. We're working out of our homes. I'm in my home office. You're in yours next to your fish tank. How do we reclaim our identity at a time where we all really need our identities right now? I mean, we can't ignore the fact that standardization has played a big part of why we have the tendency, in many cases, of unknowingly losing our identity. Why do you think that in today's more personalized world, people are going to be more courageous to make sure that, number one, they reclaim it, but number two, that they don't lose it again?
Yeah, I think the reason people will be more courageous in this moment is because you have to. Our ability to ignore the fact that there's a fish tank next to me and that this door will open and a child will come in it, probably while we're talking, is very much my reality. And when we were working from the office, I could control for those things. And when you think about working in an office, there were a lot of things that we could control for. For the most part, everybody showered, did their hair, makeup, dressed a certain way, showed up at a certain time, got there a certain way, potentially parked in the same place. So you think about all that sort of autopilot stuff we were all doing before, none of us are doing anymore. And the standards of what you should or shouldn't be doing between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. and what time you show up and how long you stay and what you do, all of that, I think, because we're working from home and everybody's just trying to make it work for themselves, that there really can't be standards because my standards don't work for you and your standards don't work for others. And I think that's why people will have to be more courageous, and it'll either be from courage or necessity. But I do think it will be, this is a moment for us to really, if you don't know who you are, I think you're going to find it. And if you already know who you are, you're going to it's going to balloon and bloom. And I think it's here to stay.
Yeah. You know, I agree with you. And in fact, you've already inspired someone because there's already a Q&A question. In fact, I'm going to open up the mic right now. And this is Lisa Stewart Brown. She says, I would love to hear more about how you're dealing with conflict now. And before you start, Lisa, did you want to open up your mic and maybe elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Lisa.
I just think that the issues around conflict and how we show up at work in specific to conflict is super important to talk about in a more authentic and clear way, and what that really means in personalization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lisa. Go ahead, Megan.
That is a great question. When I think about the context, personalization, knowing yourself, knowing the other person, and then the external environment, I think this is probably one of the most external conflict environments that I personally have ever experienced. And where I found conflict to be most effective, so I'm somebody, if you ask there's a few people on the call that have known me for some time. One of the things that people would say about me is that Megan's not afraid of conflict. Megan doesn't like unresolved conflict. That is true. I'm a truth teller. I kind of just need us to be honest with one another. And what I found with conflict is trying to understand where the other person is coming from. So, Glenn, you will often ask, do you know me? Do you see me? And I would tell you, the better you know someone and the better you can see someone, the conflict, it's not conflict in terms of it's a debate, it's conflict in terms of it's understanding where the other person's coming from is how I feel like that is how to best deal with it. But it does require you to be very curious about where the other person's coming from. And when they share with you whatever they say, to listen and not be judging, and to listen, not to prepare for a response. And that I would say is shockingly challenging, especially if you don't agree from the outset.
Well, and to follow up, and thank you, Megan. I mean, let's face it. One thing we've learned about standardization is that rather than bending, it's actually been breaking. And what is this break represented? It's represented a time to feel that we shouldn't be judged for our thinking, for our ability to contribute. And so what was conflict in the past, I believe, is now we have conditions today to feel as if we can be more inclusive so that conflict doesn't arise. I mean, at the end of the day, right now, we're dealing with the playbook that nobody has the answers for. And the ones that are going to solve it are the ones that are actually touching the business. And for leaders, that means that we not only need to lead the business, but we need to take more time to get our hands dirty as we create this new playbook. So when I think about conflict, I think it's more driven by fear than by opportunity. And I think that it's an opportunity right now to look at conflict more so as healthy tension, because let's face it, we're dealing with an environment and factors around us that people should be more open-minded to this different environment of chaos that is now overtaking what was once efficiency. So I think that this topic's a really good one, and thanks for asking, Lisa. But just to kind of move forward on the conversation, Megan, one thing about this reclaiming our identity, and I'd like to frame this for you, and we're going to get a little bit provocative now because people want to get into the deep issues. Let's face it, recent census polls, in fact, Guillermo, if you could pull up that slide of the recent, and I hope that most of you have taken the census in 2020, but some early census numbers have come out. And one of the key findings, if you go to the next slide, Guillermo, really shows the following. And take a look at the slide in front of you, please. But what it shows is that right now, 80% of the population identified as white in 2018. By 2000, you can see that dropped to 69.1%. And by 2019, those numbers are now expected to show that it stands at around 60.1%. And again, we can share these slides with you, with those that have attended via email. But go to the next slide, please, Guillermo. This one's very telling. What's it telling us? That the data analytics from the folks at Brookings, who was given access to these early 2020 consensus numbers, suggest that the last decade will be the first in American history where the white population declined in numbers. Think about that. The first time that the white population declined in numbers. So why do I share this? Because if you go back to the cultural demographic shift, the shift that we're all experiencing right now, especially with this recent social unrest, suggests what? The cultural demographic shift is when large cultural segments of the population reach numbers sufficient enough to have a significant effect on what we do and how we act. So Megan, my question to you is this: with more and more minorities in the workplace, impacted all by this social unrest in one way, shape, or form, and I'm not suggesting that those that are not diverse, whatever that means, those that are come from white Caucasian backgrounds that I think have diversity in their own right. I think we're seeing this movement that says, wait a second, as a person of color, minority, diverse talent, we need to be heard and known. We need to be seen and known. And so I'd like for you to think about the following question, Megan, and then I'm actually going to share it as a poll question. And here's the question. Do you feel that diverse populations are encouraged to work and think in ways shaped by their cultural background? In fact, I'll add to it, ethnicity and or gender identity. Do you think that that's the case? Or are you starting to sense that they feel more encouraged, Megan?
I think people are certainly encouraged. I think to me, how do you define encouraged is at the heart of that question, right? So to me, it's what are you overtly saying? What is a leader saying or doing that makes people feel encouraged? But saying or doing that you want people to bring their whole selves to work is not enough. I also think you have to have the environment for it. And I think it's the leader's job to say they want it and expect it, but I also think it's the leader's job to create the climate that allows the person to actually do that. You got to be able to provide both. And to me, when I think of that question, I think there's more people saying for sure that they want, diverse populations to bring their whole selves to work, whatever that means. And with all the social unrest, if you didn't say it before, you kind of have to now. And I think there's power in that movement. I think that's that 50% number versus the 50% number at play there. Yeah. So if you weren't saying it before, I think a lot of organizations now for sure are. But I think the ones that are going to make a difference are the ones that, sort of put your money where your mouth is, create the environment for it. It's not enough to say that you want it, that you expected. You really have to create the climate for it. And that's, for me, that's like, are you sincere? Are you sure? Are you really willing to put the work in that comes with that encouragement?
Thank you, Megan. So let's put this to the test now, right? Let's launch the polling question, and I'll give you 1 minute. Do you feel encouraged to work and think in a way shaped by your cultural background, ethnicity, and or gender identity? Another 30 seconds. Again, if you don't feel comfortable answering, you don't have to answer, but we're at about 66% of people that have voted. Okay, another couple seconds. Here we go. So I've ended the poll, and now I'll share the results. Okay, so 84% said sometimes, 11% said rarely, 5%, one person said never. Megan, does it surprise you that always wasn't selected?
No.
Why do you think that is? And I'd like to, I know there's a lot going on in the chat room right now, but I'd like to get a sense of why and what is it that you're thinking and feeling, those of you that have joined the call. I mean, why is it that we're not always encouraging this? Why do you think, Megan, as we wait for a question?
I think part of the reason why people don't feel like this goes back to, it's one thing to say, hey, I want you to bring your whole self to work. And it's another to create that environment. And I think creating the environment's a lot harder than just stating that is what you expect or that is what you're hoping for. And that for me is why it doesn't surprise me that always was the response, because it's very difficult. And I think your next question is going to be, why do you think it's so difficult? For me, and I can only speak for myself, what it takes for me to be comfortable is going to be different than what it takes the next person to feel comfortable and so forth. And to try to get it right, it takes such a personalized touch. It has to be made for that person. And so if you think about, if you're in a large company, a large meeting, or a large setting, what makes one person comfortable versus the other is not the same. So how do you strike that balance so that more people feel comfortable and encouraged to really bring all of their individual thoughts? I think that's why it's so hard. And that's why I'm not surprised it doesn't say always.
Yeah. Well, in our research, we asked the question to leaders. We asked them how mindful are you of your employees and our colleagues' unique differences? And 74% of them said always and sometimes. But then when we asked those leaders' employees, 80% of them said rarely are they aware. So the bottom line is we're at a point now where one's identity, respecting one's cultural background, gender identity, et cetera, is going to be part of the new conversation. And thus I share this because oftentimes when we're compressed with lots of standardization, personalization, standardization has a tendency to reacting to it in a very extreme way, which we need to be careful of because we're here to try to find unity. But in the process of unity, I think what we're finding is a greater level of division, and we need to be careful about that. You know, one of the questions that we have for you here comes from Mike Martell. Mike, if you're still on the line, he says, how are you now finding that healthy balance between your ideas and beliefs and your corporation's ideas and beliefs? What do you think about that, Megan?
It's a daily battle. I think what encourages me as I've become more aware of how much of what I do is sort of 19 years of autopilot and how much of it's, no, actually, this is what I believe. What I've been really happy to find is of the things that I deeply value and believe in, they're really consistent with where I work. And so in a lot of ways, me discovering that about myself has only actually made me more loyal and more committed because there is such strong alignment. And in the places where there is an alignment, I think having the conviction and the courage and being comfortable to say something so that I can put them back in alignment is something that is a newer part of the journey that I'm on.
Yep.
But at least it gives me a chance to align them. And just even taking stock of this is where I'm aligned and this is where I'm not, and where I'm not, let me see if I can get them in alignment. Just even that journey has made me like feel more empowered. I think it's improved the impact that I'm having. And I think when I would have first started on this journey a couple months ago, I thought it would actually pull me apart. I really did. I was like, gosh, I hope this doesn't end with us parting ways. And what I've discovered is it's actually just strengthened the relationship.
That's excellent, Megan. So on that note, and we're going to have Jeff, he's going to get on the mic here in just a moment. But he's raised his hand, so he's eager. So I'll hold off the polling question that aligns perfectly with this question. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon, Glenn. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Good. Hey, so I may be going backwards. Actually, I might have hit the button a second late. But what I was actually thinking about on the topic around your last polling question there is I think there's also a hesitancy historically to want to point towards recognition of someone else's, I'll call it, unique identity, for fear that you are labeling them as being representative of an entire group of people. So for example, a simple maybe sort of social question, how old are you? Right? Well, if you make a suggestion that somebody seems to be really young or really old and try to draw out, if you will, the nuance associated with their perspective based on age, there could be a backlash historically of people thinking, oh, they're picking on them because they're young, or they're calling out that they're old. So people find comfort and safety in not drawing to, I'll call it, the unique imprint that each person has. And that's why I think when you say, are people encouraged, in the way the polling question is written, are people encouraged to bring forth their unique identity? I think that might be part of the problem, is that it's not necessarily that somebody is discouraging, but it's not avidly encouraged as well. Does that make sense? Because people are scared to actually suggest that they're observant of a unique imprint that a person has, or a unique background or potential representative of a community that they might be.
Thank you, Jeff. You want to tackle that one, Megan?
Yeah, I what it makes me think about is if you are, is this general discomfort with, can we talk about that? It's a little bit of the elephant in the room. I don't want to label somebody. I don't want to, words are so charged right now. And if you're not careful with them, they get thrown around and you end up creating an environment that you hadn't intended. So I do think this, when you said you talked about fear, I think worried that you're going to step on someone's toes, worried that you're going to offend somebody, worried that you're going to put a label on something. And so people tend just to retreat a little bit. And I think so whether or not that's discouraging or not, it's retreating, and that's not what we need right now. But every time I feel like, at least as I'm watching and when I do this, when I step in, sometimes I wish I just hadn't done that and retreated myself. So I think that's that tension and that balance. And I think that it makes it hard to feel safe to just show up and do your thing when that's all going through the back of your mind, and you end up getting focused on all of that instead of the problem that you're actually trying to solve.
Thank you, Megan. I'm going to go to our next polling question, and then we have another guest question that I like to address, just so we maintain the momentum and flow of the discussion. So here is the question. I'm going to launch the poll. Do you feel free to share an opinion that contradicts an organizational norm, or that contradicts the opinion of someone higher up than you? You feel free to share an opinion that contradicts an organizational norm, or that contradicts the opinion of someone higher up than you. Okay, we got good. Okay, we got 68% that are in. I'll give it another 10 seconds. Okay, good. Another one in. Thank you. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to end the polling. Here are the results. And then Megan, I'd like for you to react to them, or if someone in our audience would like to react. So 5%, one of you said you do feel free. 47% said sometimes, 42% said rarely, and 5% said never. We already have a note in the chat that said, perhaps if it said rather than always, it said frequently, perhaps the results might look a little different. Thank you so much for that comment. So Megan, where does this align with your thoughts?
I would have said sometimes. And for me, the reason it's not always, I guess there's two things. For me personally, not every battle is worth fighting. I don't have that kind of energy. Being able to express how you feel, especially if it's different than the norm or from a leader, is not an activity that's effortless. It requires effort. Not only does it require courage, but oftentimes I feel compelled to explain, this is what I think, and this is why, and therefore this is what I think we should do. That is a very long thing. And sometimes I just don't have the energy for it. And so for me, like the always, first of all, I think it's just good balance to not tackle everything that you agree or disagree with. You got to pick, for me personally, I just pick the ones that matter most. And then put my shoulder into the ones that matter most. Because I think in the quest to understand and hear me, people will ask questions that like maybe I don't know the answers to, or that I hadn't thought of myself. Like, why do I think that? Why do I believe that? And I think sometimes the questions are posed to judge, and sometimes the questions are posed to listen. But either way, it takes effort on my part to be able to answer them. And that's, so for me, it's a little bit of like, I don't feel comfortable, a little bit of, I don't have the energy, and a little bit of not feeling like I have a complete thought and being a little embarrassed about that. So for me, that's why it's at sometimes.
Thank you, Megan. I'm going to jump to a question that was asked earlier on. And I apologize. This is from Brian. And Brian, if you want to get on the open mic, that'd be great. And his question was, how does this workplace moment, this moment of working from home and having to be agile because of COVID, prepare us for the cultural demographic shift that's happening right now in the US? You have any thoughts on that, Megan?
I love what's happening right now as it prepares us. I think that one of the reasons that I think it's going to be so effective is because it's happening to all of us. So the example that I often see at work is, well, I've always had a remote team. They're really not that impacted, or either they're not that impacted. I've always had a remote team, or even though my remote team's life hasn't changed, it's still better for them. Why do we think that is? And what I've seen and what I've spoken with others is we're all on an even playing field anymore. It's not, some of us are on a Zoom meeting and some of us are in a large conference room that got, video conferenced in. We're all in a Zoom meeting. And there's something unifying about that experience. And so, like I said, like the door is going to open before this is over, where one of my kids are going to come in and embarrass me. And I think the fact that so many people can relate to a version of that. I think, Glenn, I think I heard a dog barking earlier. I was like, I bet he doesn't like that, but I bet he does. What he doesn't know is all of us have some version of a dog barking. And so I feel like this is that moment, that humanizing moment where you are is so real. You can't get away from it. And we're all in that spot together. I think there is something so powerful about that it would be a tragedy not to see this as an opportunity to accelerate that.
Very good. Thank you. Brian, did you want to expand more on your question or share any thoughts?
Hi, Glenn. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes, I can. Thank you so much, Brian.
Great. Yeah. And thanks, Megan, for answering the question and your perspective as well. And I think Megan really answered it. The only thing I'll add is it is interesting how we cannot lose the momentum and the experience we're facing right now. Because too often when we experience something, we're able to be agile and say, yes, we can adapt to the new world, or we can see it adapt this way. But at some point when we come back to a new normal, if we don't take time to really reflect how we feel, how we're leading, and more importantly, getting to know all of our associates and peers for who they are as a person, we'll be doomed to repeat what we just came back from.
Brian, that is so well put. In fact, I like how these things have a way of shaping nicely. And you've just led us into our next polling question. And it's our final polling question. And it reads, and I'm launching it right now. Do you feel seen or known as an individual by your leaders? Do you feel seen or known as an individual by your leaders? We have 64% thus far. 20, 30 seconds. Okay. Got a few more if they'd like to vote. Remember, your answers are anonymous, so. Okay. I'm going to end the poll. Here's the results. 50% said yes, 28 said somewhat, and 22 said no. So is there anyone courageous enough on the call who said no that wants to share their experience? I mean, we're here to have a very open, transparent conversation. If you want to raise your hand, that'd be great. Okay, I don't see any. It's okay. Oh, I see one. I see one. Is that you, Gustavo?
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hey, Gustavo. Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you. So just to give context about my answer, I actually answered somewhat. I didn't say no specifically, but it's interesting to me that even though I am a very transparent individual, and I think you know me very well for several years, it's hard sometimes for leaders in organization to truly, really know you. And it shows to me that either A, there is a lack of interest perhaps on a more personal level on the individual, or B, there is something systematically wrong in the way we run our organizations sometimes. And this is not a critique because I have many great leaders that I work with, but what I will say is that it takes a long time sometimes for you to be really seen as an individual as opposed to just another role in the machine in corporate, if that makes sense.
Now, not only does it make sense, but let's remember, this is not just about the leader's responsibility, it's ours as well. I mean, do we show up as the individuals we want people to know and feel comfortable and confident with? Or are we just playing the part and assimilating and creating our own artificial identity? Therefore, nobody will ever know us as an individual.
Exactly. But my point to you is that I consider myself a person who does not assimilate, right? And so even when you try not to assimilate, there is something on the way we run organizations, especially big organizations, perhaps, that creates some kind of barrier for you to get to know people. It takes a long time for the process, and to your point, it takes both sides to get to it. But it's not an individual versus leader issue. To me, it's more like a corporate setup issue.
It should be humans with humans, right, Gustavo?
Yeah.
So here's the question. Knowing something's right isn't enough to start doing what's right, and knowing something's wrong isn't enough to stop doing it. Why, Megan?
I think it gets a lot at what Gustavo was saying, is it takes time. So knowing the right thing to do is not enough. You have to start. And
who has the responsibility, you or the leader?
In my opinion, it's the leader. That doesn't mean the employee or the individual doesn't have a role. And I'm both a leader, a learner, and an employee. You know, you have the joy of being all of the above. But I do think the responsibility when it comes to a workplace environment, it's the leader. It's you set the tone, you set the expectations, and you're paid to do the heavy lifting. Like, that's what you do. And so I think it would be easy to make a case for why it should be the individual. It would be easy to make the case for why it should be something else. But the reality is that I think the leader owns it. And the time consuming part is to really know, do you feel seen? To know someone, that does take time. And in order to get to know someone, it does require the individual to step up and make sure that they're bringing their whole selves to work. But if the leader isn't creating an environment that makes them comfortable to do that, then it's a two-way issue, but you got to start somewhere.
So Megan, let's, I know this is a tough question, but we have no more time. I mean, we had the luxury of time. These are not issues. What's happening now was accelerated by COVID and the death, and the murder, I should say, of George Floyd. But these problems have existed historically in corporate America. I mean, so with no time, what do we do? And by the way, this is just a question for you. It's a question for everyone that's in attendance right now. The luxury of time is over. And I think this goes back to Brian's question of how can we better prepare ourselves for the cultural demographic shift now, given that we're in the most personal time in our lives ever in corporate America. I mean, there is no time. So how do we accelerate this? What are your thoughts, Megan? Just first thing that comes to mind.
I think it requires courage. So when there is no time, you do what you think is right. You do what you think is best. You accept that you're going to make some mistakes and you're going to break a few things, and you accept that there are some things that are going to go right and great, and you're going to learn and build from that. So I think it's this sort of like, you know what, I don't know if this is right. I don't have time to check in with the 45 people I would have normally checked in with to be assured of it. I checked in with 2 or 3 trusted points of views, and off we go. And I think at this point, making a new mistake, learning something new is far more valuable than not changing it all and saying, you know, why, at least I did it the same way I always did. I was like, that is of no consolation, I think, right now to anybody. So for me personally, with there not being time to wait, it's just act and accept that you will be wrong, and be okay with that.
You know what? I like that a lot, Megan. And it reminds me of a couple of things. Because I'm going to give you my opinion on this question in just a moment. And I want to remind our audience, if they're not aware of this, you know, we all seem to think that what's most important in building healthy cultures is employee engagement. I'm going to tell you that that's not true. What matters most is that people feel that they can work in an environment where no one is judged. There's a big distinction between the two. And we've reached a point now to what you said, Megan, and I'll say it just a little bit differently. Ask for forgiveness later. Be bold. Now's the time, because if you're being judged for being bold, there's a bigger leadership issue and a greater systemic issue within the organization. The other thing, well, what can we do? The luxury of time is over. Well, I'll share with you what I've done in my own organization is, first of all, I've always been authentic to who I am. And I feel very strongly about that. And even during my days in corporate America, I remember one time I came home from a large meeting and I said to my dad, I said, hey, Dad, they're telling me that I need to, you know, kind of tone things down. And my dad said, son, don't ever forget I told you this. You keep being who you are, but there's a caveat. You have to deliver the results. And once you deliver those results, they're going to let you be whoever you want to be. So I'll let you just think about that as it relates to results versus methods. But if I can step back a moment and bring it back to, well, there's no luxury of time. How do we act? You know, there are some generations, and I've made them clear earlier with the generational shifts that have been led by those that represent the cultural demographic shift, these millennials and Gen Z. They're not so inclined to assimilate. And I know that we've got a few on the call, so I'm hoping that you guys will raise your hands and speak up here. But we've got a few millennials on our team. In fact, I made the decision 3 years ago to just be led by one of our millennials.
And Glenn,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Gustavo. I'm not a millennial, as you know, but I just wanted to say something.
Sure.
To your point about this new generation does not want to assimilate, that's exactly the point. And I'm going to connect that with what Megan just said about being bold, right? Or what you said about being bold. I think if you pay attention, there is a lot of reassessment of relationships in these times. You see that for couples, you see that a lot, you know, partnerships. The same is happening for corporations. So one of the things that Megan was discussing before is how her values align to the organization. The new generation is not going to wait for corporations to reassess their values in the next 3 years so they can fit that culture, you see? So that's why this is a time of being bold and really look inside to figure out, are you in the right place for your skill set, first of all? And then once you're in that place, does the values of the place really allow you to maximize your potential as a human and so on, right?
Yeah, no question about it, Gustavo. And this is the exact reason why I made a decision to have the millennial be my boss. And you can read it all in Talent Development Magazine. They did a big feature on it a few years ago. The whole point was I started realizing that my own relevancy as an individual, let alone an influencer, was really dependent upon listening to a generation that had an entirely different perspective about thinking, content, engagement. And I literally had to reinvent myself. And I share that because being bold doesn't mean disrupting status quo or disrupting, you know, in managing upward. It's about looking at yourself in the mirror and recognizing to reclaim your identity, you yourself have to reinvent, even from those people that may not have a clue about what corporate life is like. It's not about the corporation. It's about you yourself as an individual feeling that you can be bold enough and have enough self-confidence and self-trust to learn how to navigate it, knowing that it's not about being perfect, but it's about having impact and being influential. So thank you for that comment, Gustavo. I'm going to come back to a question here that was sent earlier, and the questions have been great. And I'd like for you to address this one, Megan, and this comes from Carolyn. Carolyn, are you still with us? Yes, you are. You there, Carolyn? Yep, she's still with us. It says, I agree leaders must create the climate to allow all people to bring their whole selves to work. Do you agree the fear of judgment plays a role in division? Well, I just addressed this a moment ago. Carolyn, do you want to extrapolate on that a little bit since we've already touched on it a little bit?
Certainly. You know, many people come into work with perspectives of their own, as you well know. And I've been in an arena of teaching classes in unconscious bias for some time. But what's most relevant is when people are coming to work and you're saying you're building an environment of inclusivity for people to bring their whole selves to work, there is still this big fear of them sharing themselves and being judged by their leaders and their peers.
Thank you.
So
I really appreciate that. Do you want to comment on that, Megan? And as you think about this, let's think about some of the millennials on your own team, Megan.
And they're on the call, so I'd love for them to say and speak up. I think fear is still very much, like I so relate to that statement. And when I think about my 23-year-old self, the fear came not from having been judged before in a corporate environment, and more about as a Chinese American growing up, you know, being picked on for being Chinese. Like, so you kind of come into it with that background, so you can't separate who you are. And so, I mean, I went into it already with if baggage, if you want to call that. So you think about, okay, if you're somebody having been judged for basically growing up in a white neighborhood, not being white, that's my experience all the way up until when I get to corporate America. And then I get judged for, you know, not speaking, not running a meeting, not kind of handling things the way that others are doing it. It's a bit of a double whammy. So you kind of have to unwind both of those things. At least I felt like I had to, and I still think fear is very much a part of that. For the millennials, I'd love to hear from them, because what you made me think of as you were talking, Glenn, is I don't know if I need to tell we have an intern that joined the team a couple weeks ago, and like just oozes courage, has no qualms about sharing anything. And there's a part of me that's like, gosh, if she comes back next year, I hope she stays that way. What do I need to do to make sure I encourage that? And I feel like, should I be overtly telling them, you know what, I'm going to learn and you're going to teach? Like, that's the setup here. I know, and because a lot of them will come with like, I want to learn this, I want to learn that from General Mills. And there's a part of me that's like, that's cool, you'll learn that. But I feel like I need to make sure I also balance it with, and by the way, I need you to teach and be really overt about that. And that's where I see some of our younger talent come in. I don't know if it's the generation or if it's something I'm doing, probably both of hey, I'm going to learn now, and I really need you to teach. And I feel like when I sit down to learn, they don't realize that they should be teaching. And then because if they don't teach, then I have to turn around and go back to telling. And that's just like, so not how I want it to be, but I don't know how to get that balance.
By the way, you just defined the conflict between standardization and personalization. It's not easy. It's not easy. So here's a question: who should be the teacher and who should be the student? Should the organization be the student and the employees be the teacher?
I think it depends. I really do. Like,
well,
I mean,
the fact that you've even said depends already proves the point that it's not about one or the other, but there needs to be a balance that is identified and respected by both sides. And this is the point. It kind of goes back to things that we all know about, right? You get your leadership competencies and you're told this is how you should behave. Well, should we? I mean, yeah, we need to respect that because that's an alignment with the brand and what the brand stands for. But what about your brand? What about your identity? How can you live and express those values through your own lens? And I think that this is where we're evolving to, and where we must evolve to quickly because we're out of time. But we still got a few more minutes on this live stream. Anybody else have any other questions? Let me see if I could address one. But while I'm looking, Megan, did you want to comment on that by chance?
On the balance, the example that I like to share, it's a bit of an exaggerated example. It's a little Captain Obvious, but like when you think about something where standardization is really important, are things like sexual harassment in the job, in the workplace. Like there are some clear-cut rules for this is acceptable, this is unacceptable, and this is what's going to happen if you cross the line. That is not an area that I'm looking for a ton of exploration and experimentation. That it's highly standardized. I look at that as something that should continue to evolve if as we learn more about society, because I'm sure 50 years ago the rules of what constituted sexual harassment looked different 50 years ago than today. So I'm not saying they can't ever change, but that's a place where I'm like, let's maybe start with a place of standardization and then move into individualization. Other things that I think should always start with individuals is an idea for the business. If there's a new problem, starting with, okay, so the last time this happened, this is what we did, is absolutely the wrong way to start, and should always start with, okay, this is the problem, here's what I think we should do. So for me, like, that's the balance. There are some things that, like, let's just start with standardization mode because those are tried and true. There's a reason why those are the way they are. But then I think there's a whole slew of areas where you want to start kind of in the complete opposite spot.
So this kind of brings us to our close. And so why should we even be thinking about reclaiming our identity? Why is it important? What is our role as a leader right now when the moment has called for us to see and know individuals more than ever before? And I'd like to leave you with this thought, that our responsibility as leaders today is to think about creating future legacies. You know, if you think about us right now, is it about solving for our generation right now? It's about solving for the next generation and helping create the opportunities to help people start thinking about legacies now. You know, we oftentimes think about what our legacy is at the end of our run in our career. And I think that it's times like this that awaken us to recognize that, well, sometimes you won't get to that end as you planned. That legacy should be thought more about at the beginning of one's career than in the end, because you just never know when something as seismic as these crises come along and change the path and the road that's ahead. So I'd like to encourage all of you that as you think about reclaiming your identity and that of others, to think about how our responsibility today is about creating a path to help others build their legacy. Any final comments, Megan? You've been wonderful, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you talking about something that's not easy, but you've leaned in, you've been courageous, and I greatly respect you for what you've said and for your time today. Any final comments?
Yeah, I think the final comments I would share is, and Brian mentioned it earlier, is we find ourselves in just like an indescribable period right now. And it's an opportunity to either accelerate or fall back into bad habits. And I think the fact that there are so many people on this call who took the time to have a discussion about this gives me hope and tells me that it's going to be an opportunity to accelerate and not to go backwards. And to me, like, that's what's so exciting. When you and I first met and started on this journey, I would have never guessed in 10 months this moment would provide itself. And which goes back to, if you haven't started to think about your legacy, if you aren't sure what your unique gifts are, if you're not comfortable bringing your whole self to work, there is nothing wrong with starting that journey today, like right this moment, and continuing on that path, because you'll never know when that moment where it will call on you to really be that person, when that's going to come. So that would be my final parting words.
You know, I'm inspired by those words, Megan, because I mean, let's think about what happened when COVID struck and it became a reality that everybody began to accept. We saw people at work that stepped up. We saw those that remained neutral. We saw others that were still trying to make a choice. And until we can find and live our identity and live true to it, you never know when the moment calls for you to practice it. And so I thank you for practicing your identity as a truth seeker today, because I think this is a topic that requires us to be in constant search of not just our truth, but that of others. Megan, thank you so much for joining us. And I thank all of you who attended today. Again, we'll have a recording of this session available. Actually, if you're watching it on the YouTube live stream, it's available. It'll be available in seconds, but we'll make sure that we get this out to you so that you can share it with your colleagues. And hopefully you could use this session as a conversation starter within your own organization and teams. Thank you very much.